Good evening and welcome. I'm Scott Wolfel, Chief Content Officer for WABE. WABE is proud to partner with True Colors Theater Company to present tonight's program, Segregated by Design. The problem of racial discrimination in housing is a story we cover doggedly at WABE with a reporter dedicated specifically to the housing beat. It's a problem that has plagued Atlanta and our country for more than a century, and with full intent, as you will see in tonight's informative film presentation, and here dissected by our distinguished panel. Tonight's event is part of True Colors Theater Company's Community Conversation series, presented in partnership with WABE and the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. Dr. Kalinda Lee, Head of Interpretation for the National Center, will be our moderator tonight. Segregated by Design is proudly sponsored by Brian Cave Leighton Paisner and Bank of America. We'd like to start tonight's program with a screening of Mark Lopez's award-winning film, Segregated by Design, based on Richard Rothstein's exhaustive book on the subject, The Color of Law, a must-read on the topic of housing discrimination. Thank you for joining us, and now, Segregated by Design.
In the middle of the 20th century, the city of St. Louis, Missouri, and the United States federal government condemned and demolished the neighborhoods in downtown St. Louis where African Americans lived, displacing thousands. They built the Gateway Arch. They built a university, interstate highways, hospitals, and middle-class housing that was unaffordable to the former African American residents. Those who were displaced then relocated to the few other places available, converting inner-ring suburbs like Ferguson into new segregated enclaves. We have been led to believe that racial segregation in housing was de facto segregation, by accident or the result of private prejudices. Yes, private prejudice clearly contributed to segregation, but by itself it could not have segregated the country without the intention of the federal government to segregate neighborhoods throughout the nation. If, however, we understand the accurate history, the history that was once well known but we've all now forgotten, that racially segregated patterns in every metropolitan area like St. Louis were created by de jure segregation, racially explicit policy on the part of federal, state, and local governments designed to segregate metropolitan areas, then we can understand that we have an unconstitutional residential landscape. And if it's unconstitutional, then we have an obligation to remedy it. The federal government in the New Deal of the Roosevelt administration of the 1930s pursued policies in the mid-20th century that segregated metropolitan areas. One important policy was the first civilian public housing program, which frequently demolished integrated neighborhoods in order to create segregated public housing. In the late 1930s, another New Deal program, the United States Housing Authority, was adopted. The very first projects built under the United States Housing Authority authorization were in Austin, Texas, because the most aggressive proponent of public housing at that time was the congressman from Austin, Lyndon Baines Johnson. And Johnson got the United States Housing Authority to put its first projects in Austin, separate projects for whites, for African Americans, and the project for Hispanics. The project for African Americans was placed in a location that the city plan of Austin had designated as a ghetto for African Americans. The United States Housing Authority and the local Austin Housing Authority demolished something called Emancipation Park, which was a celebrations location for the abolition of slavery. The design was to move all African Americans in the city of Austin into this community, whether in public housing or in private housing. The city of Austin then began to close schools for African Americans elsewhere in the city and close libraries and other public facilities to force African Americans to move to the east side. Another program that the federal government pursued to enforce segregation was the work of the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, which subsidized the development of suburbs like Levittown, New York, on condition that they only be sold to white families and that the homes in those suburbs had deeds that prohibited resale to African Americans. The Federal Housing Administration's underwriting manual said that inharmonious racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities, meaning that loans to African Americans could not be insured. Government at all levels throughout the nation were involved in promoting and enforcing the restrictive deeds in homes and places like Levittown, and judges enforced the view that these deeds did not violate the Constitution because they were private agreements. Although white middle-class families that moved into suburbs like Levittown could buy property with no down payments if they were veterans and low-interest mortgages, middle-class African Americans had to make substantial down payments and get uninsured mortgages with higher interest rates. In many, if not most cases, African Americans could not get mortgages at all because the federal government would not insure them. As a result, they bought their homes on contract, like an installment plan where they accumulated no equity and could be evicted from their homes in the event of a single missed payment. Thus, contract buyers did not have the option of leaving a declining neighborhood before their properties were paid for in full. If they did, they would lose everything they'd invested in that property to date. The term redlining comes from the federal government's creation of maps of urban areas nationwide. And those maps were color-coded to indicate where it was safe to insure mortgages. Anywhere African Americans lived, even places where African Americans lived nearby, were colored red to indicate to appraisers that these neighborhoods were too risky for the FHA to insure. The FHA's justification was that if African Americans bought homes in white neighborhoods, or even if they bought homes near those neighborhoods, the property values of the homes they were insuring, the white homes they were insuring, would decline, and therefore their loans would be at risk. In 1940, for example, a Detroit builder was denied FHA insurance for a project that was near an African American neighborhood. He then constructed a half-mile concrete wall, 6 feet high and a foot thick, separating the two neighborhoods, and then the FHA approved the loan. In the 3 decades during which it administered this policy, however, the agency never provided or obtained evidence to support its claim that integration undermined property values. In fact, often racial integration caused property values to increase because African Americans' housing supply was so restricted and they had so many fewer choices. If African Americans had access to housing throughout metropolitan areas, supply and demand balances would have kept their rents and home prices at reasonable levels. Without access, landlords and sellers were free to take advantage of the greater demand relative to supply for African American housing. A 1946 National Magazine article described a Chicago building where the landlord had divided a 540-square-foot storefront into 6 cubicles, each housing a family. He had similarly subdivided the second story. Total monthly rent was as great as that generated by a luxury apartment on Chicago's Gold Coast along Lake Michigan. Such exploitation was possible only because public policy denied African Americans opportunities to participate in the city's white housing market. As the federal government concentrated low-income African Americans in single neighborhoods, the homes became overcrowded. Families had to subdivide their homes to make their mortgage payments or their property tax payments. Cities frequently withdrew public services from African American neighborhoods. They collected garbage less frequently. They didn't provide water and sewer services. Polluting industry and toxic waste plants were placed in African American communities in order to protect white neighborhoods from deterioration. The result was that African American neighborhoods frequently turned into slums. White homeowners looked at these places and assumed that slum conditions were characteristics of African Americans, not of government policy that forced this kind of overcrowding. White homeowners then became resistant to African Americans moving into their neighborhoods because they thought they would bring slum conditions with them. Of course, the slums were not created by the people. They were created by the forced concentration, the overcrowding in these neighborhoods. Blockbusting was a scheme in which speculators bought properties in borderline black-white areas, rented or sold them to African American families at above-market prices, persuaded white families residing in these areas that their neighborhoods were turning into African American slums and that values would soon fall precipitously, and then purchased the panicked white homes for less than their worth. Blockbusters' tactics included hiring African American women to push carriages with their babies through white neighborhoods, hiring African American men to drive cars with radios blasting through white neighborhoods, or making random telephone calls to residents of white neighborhoods and asking to speak to someone with a stereotypically African American name, like Johnny May. State licensing agencies that regulated real estate agents could have easily stopped this practice. All they had to do was to lift the license of one or two real estate agents who engaged in these practices, and the practices would have ended. While many de jure segregation policies aim to keep African Americans far from white residential areas, public officials also shifted African American populations away from downtown business districts so that white commuters, shoppers, and business elites would not be exposed to black people. This was accomplished with slum clearance. One slum clearance tool was the construction of the federal interstate highway system. In many cases, state and local governments, with federal acquiescence, designed interstate highway routes to destroy urban African American communities. In the 1950s, there was a white middle-class neighborhood in Los Angeles that wealthy African Americans began to move into. It was called Sugar Hill. The first thing that happened was that the neighborhood association got together and tried to buy out the African American families who were moving in, offering them more money than the African Americans had paid in order to get them out of the neighborhood. When that didn't work, white homeowners tried to enforce a legal agreement prohibiting them from living in the neighborhood. And when that didn't work, the city council then decided it would be an African American neighborhood. It rezoned it for multiple family housing. It eventually became a slum. And then the Santa Monica Freeway was built to clear that slum to destroy the neighborhood. So these policies all worked together in an unconstitutional fashion to segregate Los Angeles. In 1957, Bill and Daisy Myers were able to purchase a home in Levittown, Pennsylvania, the Levitt Company's second large development. When the mail carrier discovered that he was delivering mail to an African-American family, he let everyone in the neighborhood know, and as many as 600 white demonstrators soon showed up in front of the Myers' house, pelting the family and their home with rocks. Law enforcement stood by as this happened. For 2 months, rocks were thrown, crosses were burned, the Ku Klux Klan symbol was painted on the wall next door. Some policemen stood with the mob, joking and encouraging its participants. One sergeant was actually demoted to patrolman because he objected to orders he had been given not to interfere with the rioters. In 1951, World War II veteran Harvey Clark, his wife Janetta, and 2 small children rented an apartment in all-white Cicero, a suburb of Chicago. When the Clarks refused to leave, a mob of 4,000 rioted, raiding the apartment, destroying the fixtures, and throwing the family's belongings out the window onto the lawn where they were set ablaze. Time magazine reported that the police officers present, quote, acted like ushers politely handling the overflow at a football stadium, unquote. The only people that the grand jury indicted were Harvey Clark, his real estate agent, his NAACP attorney, and the white landlady who rented the apartment to him, as well as her attorney, on charges of inciting a riot and conspiring to lower property values. Stories like this were commonplace, and state-sponsored violence was a means, along with many others, by which all levels of government maintained segregation. Today, African American incomes are about 60% of white incomes. But African American wealth is about 10% of white wealth. Most middle-class families in this country gain their wealth from the equity they have in their homes. So this enormous difference between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is almost entirely attributable to federal housing policy implemented through the 20th century. African American families that were prohibited from buying homes in the suburbs in the 1940s and 50s, and even into the 60s by the Federal Housing Administration, gained none of the equity appreciation that whites gained. Across the country in new developments, these homes in the late 1940s and 1950s sold for about twice national median income. They were affordable to working-class families with an FHA or VA mortgage. African Americans were equally able to afford those homes as whites, but were prohibited from buying them. Today, those homes sell for $300,000 to $400,000 at the minimum, 6 to 8 times national median income. The white families sent their children to college with the wealth they gained from appreciating home equity. They were able to take care of their parents in old age and not depend on their children. They were able to bequeath wealth to their children. None of those advantages accrued to African Americans who, for the most part, were prohibited from buying homes in those suburbs. So in 1968, we passed the Fair Housing Act that said, in effect, okay, African Americans, you're now free to buy homes in the suburbs that had been forbidden. But it's an empty promise, because those homes are no longer affordable to the families whose parents or grandparents could have afforded them when whites were buying into those suburbs and gaining the equity and wealth that followed from their purchases. Consider children who come from families where they're economically stressed, or in poor health because they have no access to good health care, or because they live in polluted environments. When they do come to school, for example, they may suffer from asthma because of that pollution and are drowsy from being awake at night, wheezing. They cannot then typically achieve at levels of children who come to school well rested. When you concentrate children like that in single classrooms, it's impossible for teachers to develop the kind of outcomes that they can in middle-class children who come to school healthy, unstressed, and able to pay attention to schooling. What economists know is that African American children from low-income families who grow up in segregated neighborhoods are less likely as adults to move into the middle class than are African American children whose families have the same low incomes but who live in integrated neighborhoods. So segregation itself impedes intergenerational mobility and perpetuates, rigidifies the inequality that we experience. Another thing that social psychologists have discovered is that decision-making is hampered when you don't have diverse decision-making groups. These psychologists have done experiments where they put people together to solve problems in both diverse groups and in segregated groups. And the diverse groups are much better able to solve problems because they challenge assumptions much more than the segregated groups do. So segregation impedes our political and economic success. We have 3 provisions in the federal Constitution that prohibit the kinds of actions that federal, state, and local governments pursued to create residential segregation. One is the Fifth Amendment, which requires the federal government to treat all citizens fairly. Another is the 14th Amendment, that requires state and local governments not only to treat citizens fairly, but to treat them equally. And then the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, also requires that we banish the effects of slavery, which Congress long ago determined was any form of second-class citizenship. So in fact, the prohibition on African Americans to purchase homes in federally subsidized white communities or the segregation of public housing created a form of second-class citizenship which was a violation of the 13th Amendment. We cannot reverse de jure segregation mainly with lawsuits. We must also build a national political consensus leading to legislation, a challenging but not impossible task. Our focus now should be to develop policies that promote an integrated society, understanding it will be impossible to fully untangle the web of unconstitutional inequality that we've woven. To begin, we should first contemplate what we have collectively done and, on behalf of our government, accept responsibility to fix it.
That was quite illuminating. Thank you again for your welcome, Scott. I'm Kalinda Lee, and I oversee education and exhibitions at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. As your moderator this evening, my first honor is to introduce the panelists. Dr. Herman Skip Mason Jr. is a native Atlantan, pastor, historian, and community advocate. He has researched and written extensively on Atlanta's history. Mark Lopez is an award-winning director and motion designer. You have just been treated to a screening of his film, Segregated by Design, this evening. And last but certainly not least, I'm introducing producer, casting director, and dramaturg Raven Drummer. She is the director of The Etiquette of Vigilance, a play inspired by A Raisin in the Sun, which very much focuses upon the history of housing segregation in this nation. As we jump into our discussion, please remember to put your questions in the meeting chat. You're invited to do that beginning immediately. So, as an historian, I am always thinking about the so what question. What I mean by that is if you're not naturally drawn to history as a topic, why should it matter to you? Why should this matter to you? What makes this interesting and worth investigation? And I always come back to two issues. One issue is that looking at the past provides context for the present. It explains how we find ourselves where we are right now, and it helps us to understand our neighbors' realities and perspectives, even if they differ from ours. Understanding the past helps us to see other struggles and triumphs in ways that are often left out of the books, especially when they have to do with African American history. The second reason that history draws people in is that the stories are, quite frankly, often incredibly compelling. The people who came before us, who shaped the world as we know it, weren't saints and sinners, messiahs and devils. They were people with ambitions similar to our own, seeking safe and comfortable homes, economic and educational opportunity for themselves and their children, freedom from violence and threats of violence for their communities. We hear their stories and we empathize with their plights, consider what forms of activism and resistance we might employ if faced with the same dilemmas. And we think about that in our time as well as in theirs. So, with all of that in mind, my first question is addressed to all of the panelists. True Colors artistic director Jamil Jude shared this quote from the great writer and playwright Lorraine Hansberry with me. And of course, Lorraine Hansberry is the playwright who wrote A Raisin in the Sun, whose work in many ways inspired the discussion that we're having today. Remember that she was born in 1935 and she died tragically young in 1965. Hansberry said this: "My father spent a small fortune, his considerable talents, and many years of his life fighting in association with the NAACP attorneys, Chicago's restrictive covenants." That is, those racially restrictive covenants that we just heard about. He fought these covenants in one of this nation's ugliest ghettos. That fight also required our family to occupy disputed property in a hellishly hostile, quote, white neighborhood, in which literally howling mobs surrounded our house. My memories of this correct way of fighting white supremacy in America include being spat at, cursed, and pummeled in the daily trek to and from school. And I also remember my desperate and courageous mother patrolling our neighborhood all night with a loaded German Luger pistol. Now, certainly, Hansberry is calling up the viciousness of housing segregation, the exhaustion of having to spend your life and energy in battle, and the physical threat that her family faced. But she's also describing how they were not simply victims. They fought the injustice of restrictive covenants, which barred Blacks from neighborhoods legally, and they fought on foot bearing arms. Too often, I think we are only presented with a single kind of turn the other cheek narrative of nonviolent protest, but people fought segregation and fight for equity now, even in lots of different ways. And I'd like to ask the panelists what forms of freedom fighting have resonated with you, surprised you? Are there any that you think we should be studying, celebrating, or modeling right now?
Well, I'll jump in. First of all, Kalinda, good evening. That's a loaded question, but necessary. Mark, excellent film. So many thoughts just going through my mind, and I'm sure so many people can relate to it. To answer your question, excuse me, I think for me, looking at Atlanta's history, that one of the ways that some of our predecessors fought so many of these challenges, predatory lending, restriction, segregation, was to build their own. And I'm reminded of the fact that one of the premier communities in Atlanta, Northwest Atlanta, is the Kaya Heights community, which was intentionally developed by African Americans and the adjacent communities surrounding, which consisted of professionals, lawyers, and doctors and educators. And this, of course, came on the hinge of the Atlanta Wall, which we'll perhaps talk about a little later, which prevented Blacks from encroaching predominantly white areas. So very briefly, I think that one of the ways to fight is to take the old Booker T. Washington model and to build your own community. Now, that doesn't necessarily negate the fact that we should be able to live wherever we desire, but understand that I think with them building this premier middle-class community, it was another way to fight the injustices that face so many African Americans in the city.
Thank you for that response. It looks like Raven is about to jump in.
Yes, yes. And thank you. I'm so happy to be a part of this conversation. I think when I think about, that ways of vocalizing, ways of being activists that are nuanced or surprising or different. I honestly, I have to say, I love the effect that social media has had, also in activism. I love for me watching, especially in 2020, how much activism became such a global, not just a personal African American community push, but a global push. I love watching how, in terms of not just space, but also in terms of ownership, in terms of wealth, in terms of businesses, in terms of this push to buy Black, in terms of resources, of what businesses and resources are in our community. I personally think it's interesting to see how that has affected how businesses have grown, how wealth has grown through an advent of something like social media.
For me, I came across this guy's story, Benjamin Lay. He was arguably like the first white abolitionist, and he was like back in Benjamin Franklin's day. He was a Quaker, and he stood up to power, like even though he could lose everything that he desired, which was to be within this Quaker community. He lost that because he said to them, "This is not right. What you're doing is crazy, and you guys are going to hell for this." And it lost his position in that community, but he knew what he was doing was right. And I think modeling that is powerful for me, to stand up for what I believe in, even if it might, some of my power might, go away with that standing up. One thing that he did, which was interesting, was he did guerrilla theater, which is like he would, like before meetings, he would in like a snowstorm, he would stand outside without his shoes on, and so that everybody that came into the theater would have to see him like freezing, and they would be like, "What are you doing?" And he'd be like, "Well, your slaves don't have shoes right now, so it's okay for me not to have shoes on right now." And like that visual, I think, kind of struck a nerve, because they would get very angry at him and like throw him out. And so, yeah, this sort of visual language that I think is powerful in what I do, I think obviously, permeates even today with more screens and more visual language everywhere.
Yeah, thank all of you. It's interesting how it seems like, you're talking about sort of personal responsibility and the various ways that we are promoting our own self-efficacy, right? The ways in which we can make a difference right where we are, but also this possibility around empathy building and around understanding that whether these problems sort of look like ours or not, they are our responsibilities to address and correct. Um, I want to go to another related question as you're raising this, but before I do that, I want to remind people one more time to drop your questions into the chat, so you'll have an opportunity to have your curiosity satisfied as well. Um, One thing that I'm thinking about is the ways that when we discuss residential segregation historically, we usually focus on the struggle of Blacks and other people of color to access neighborhoods and neighborhood services that are made available to whites. So, in many major cities, we are now also considering the efforts of Blacks, especially poor communities of color, to remain in the city center areas where whites are rediscovering desirability, right? So that at one point we were thinking a lot primarily about going into quote white areas, and now there's a big concern about Black folks essentially being displaced. And in cities, particularly outside of Atlanta, it's often the case that there are other people of color who are being displaced by predominantly white gentrifiers. So I want to talk a little bit about what's desirable, I'm putting that sort of in air quotes, as a place to live, work, and otherwise engage, and what resources have been critical in creating thriving and desirable neighborhoods that are majority minority. And I want to start that answering with Dr. Mason again, because you already kind of began to take us there when talking about Collier Heights. But talk a little bit about what it means to create a community that is thriving, that may not be about following white flight.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Lynn. I should have given a little historical context. Even before Kaya Heights, we had African American developers. Alonzo Franklin Herndon, founder of Atlanta Life Insurance Company, he purchased property in the Vine City area, specifically with the intent to provide housing, low and middle income housing for constituents in the community. You had Heman Perry, who was a Black banker, founder of what is now the Citizens Trust Bank. And he, of course, created subdivisions and development specifically for African Americans. So I wanted to provide that context because Kaya Heights was not the first, but it is one of the most noted. Desirable, I think every family should have the opportunity to live decently, with the services that their taxes and the monies services provide, and to live in a community, in a neighborhood that is hopefully maintained and well kept. We don't have time to talk about the history of the building of public housing in the city of Atlanta. That's another whole story within itself. It accommodated and it wiped out many of the slum areas in the city, Beaver Slide and over near Georgia Tech, as an opportunity to create housing for a lower income Blacks and whites, not just African Americans. Let me be very clear on that, but basic accommodations. I think, though, that Du Bois and Frederick Douglass informs us in this manner. It was actually Frederick Douglass in 1881 who first uttered the word "the color line," but it was Du Bois who gave it some meat. And of course, Du Bois talked about the problem of the 21st century is the problem of the color line. Well, it's not only the 21st, it's the 22nd, and I suspect the 23rd century as well, because we are currently experiencing that. Living comfortably in Atlanta now, if you're trying to move back, is an absolute feat. Trying to find affordable housing because of the increase of pricing of houses within the city. Those who are maintaining property that was owned by parents and grandparents and trying to pay taxes on that. And there are some programs that are to assist, but there are some people who live outside the rim that They don't have that. So I'm rambling and I'm saying a lot because I'm excited. I got to go back and watch the film again. It was so much to take in, but it is a necessary conversation because what a raisin in the sun demonstrates is what we're seeing right now happening. The new Jim Crow, different methods, different ways, but it's certainly preventing people and some people of color from having and living a lifestyle based on the ability of affordability, if that makes any sense. Yeah.
It makes a lot of sense. Thank you for all of that. Um, you pushed our attention towards Raisin again. And so, Raven, I want to ask you about that, about this question within that context, right? Because I think part of what comes up there is about um, not only a sense of access to opportunities, but also a sense of belonging, and what it means to build community and desire to live within a community and to be comfortable in a community. Can you speak to that a little bit more?
Absolutely. I think, especially as it pertains to the etiquette of vigilance, which is this kind of beautiful sequel to Raisin in the Sun, which basically follows the life of Travis, who in Raisin in the Sun, we were introduced to him as a 10-year-old little boy. And now we're being introduced in this project, as a 50, 60-year-old man, and to see the results of his ancestors' parents' decisions on moving in out of a predominantly Black area into, predominantly white. And I think that the playwright did such a beautiful job of basically explaining that through the eyes of his daughter and some of the social challenges that she has as she's now kind of the odd woman out, not having her own culture reflected on her from her community. And we see later on in the play this desire that this character has to see herself in the place that she lives. And although her family is physically based in the suburbs, she kind of is very led to finding her people who are not there, who are in the quote unquote projects. So it's interesting that it's not just the actual, physically being in the space, but making sure that your identity, your values, your culture is reflected back to you is something that this particular piece of art reflects.
Thanks. I'm excited to see it. I think it
Mhm.
really begs the question of what we mean by integration, right? Whether
Absolutely.
we're
Yes.
talking about just entering a segregated space or
Yes.
having true integration and representation. Mark, I
Mhm.
want to twist that question a little bit for you in terms of thinking about the past as a context for the present. And so, you so beautifully presented this context for or the story of what happened on all of these different levels to marginalize African Americans in residential segregation. But I'm wondering if you've given some more thought as well to kind of what's happening right now in terms of this uh, desire for folks with means, often white people, to move back into city centers that they fled before, and what that looks like for African Americans who are being displaced. I would just put in context for Atlanta, I think it's really interesting that 2015 statistically was the first year since 1960 that the population within the city of Atlanta was more white than Black. So 2015 was that first year, which means the first census year was 2020. Um, that was recorded. And of course, we know that the cost of living within the city is skyrocketing and people's access to the city is dwindling in many cases.
Yeah, I think that's a nationwide problem. I live in Austin, Texas, and especially historically East Austin it was featured in the film. It was the where the first African American project was built, and now it's like super gentrified and very very expensive to live down there. Um, but yeah, so what come to mind, I just actually finished doing two videos for this company out of North Carolina that they help Black businesses with gaining lending from banks for their commercial business so that they can own the real estate that the commercial land is on. And I think that's one of the big problems that you see is like Skip was saying, when the property tax goes too high, those businesses have to move out because the rent will be like ridiculous, and you have to get out because you can't afford to run your business there anymore. But if you own the land and you don't have to pay rent, then all of a sudden you can maybe, you know, keep that community alive. And because Black businesses are historically also really good at hiring Black people. And with that comes a thriving community. And I think that's what is missing more, because banks don't lend money to Black people as much as white people. And that's like a fact. And it's really sad, but that needs to change, first of all. And investors need to pour money into these businesses also. So not just like banks, but also private citizens need to pour, because these businesses are going to be, you know, they're run by people that are successful. They just don't have the means to succeed as people that look like me do. And that's ridiculous. So that's the sort of thing that I think needs to change.
Thank you. You've brought our attention, all of you, to issues of law, to issues of policy, to issues of attitude, to issues of culture. And I'm going to segue now to take in a little bit more culture by introducing a performance that we have. Maisha McQueen will perform I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free by Nina Simone. Miss McQueen is going to be accompanied by S. Renee Clark.
It would feel to be free. I wish I could break all the chains holding me. I wish I could say all the things I should say. Say them loud, say them clear, for the whole round world to hear. I wish I could share all the love that's in my heart. Remove all the bars that keep us apart. I wish I could know what it means to be one. See and agree, every man should be free. Oh, started anew. Well, I wish I could fly like a bird in the sky. How sweet it would be if I found out I could fly. I soar to the sun and look down at the sea, and I'd sing, 'cause I know how it feels to be free. Oh, I sing 'cause I know how it feels to be free. Oh, I sing 'cause I know how it feels to be free. Ooh, be free.
Thank you for that beautiful rendition of the singer, songwriter, and freedom fighter Nina Simone's song. In so many ways, it really is about what we're talking about today, right? Which is about true freedom. I'm going to pose another question to the entire panel with that in mind. But before I do so, I want to remind everybody who's tuning in that this is a larger conversation. So please don't forget to drop your questions into the chat because we'll be turning to Q&A very shortly. This evening, we are talking about something that our society finds incredibly difficult to confront. And that's the reality of racist government policies that have limited African Americans' access to residential equity. In so many ways, that forces people to confront the reality of racist government policies that have limited African Americans' access to any kind of equity. By choice and force, national and local policies prevented Black folks from living where they wish, gaining generational wealth that comes from profitable home ownership, and the legacy of that continues to fuel a drastic racial wealth gap. Why do you think that theater and short film and song are effective means to address these complicated issues? And specifically, what unique contributions do your art forms make to this discussion?
I think that when it comes to, you know, this particular art form and theater and film, I think the beauty of it is exposure. I think that entertainment has this beautiful way of um, entertaining, but also exposing large groups of people to information. This beautiful film is a beautiful example of how using filmmaking to educate as well. So I think art is just a beautiful way of educating and of exposing audiences that would otherwise not know any of this. And then seeing how that can be translated into actual change and activism is something that I think, only filmmaking or theater is really capable of doing on a large scale.
Yeah, I agree. I think for this book in particular, it was taking a bunch of data and making it interesting. Because I mean, the data's there, and these are facts. It's all history, but let's give it life, because there's lives underneath the data, and like theater in particular too, like shows you these are people, like real people living through these experiences and not just like data points, and I think when you see the visual, when you see people, when you see the story expressed this way, it kind of means a little more, because we are emotional people, and we understand things in a more human sense, you know.
I totally agree. If I could jump in, I am a lover of the arts, theater. In fact, I'm trying to schedule my next Broadway run because there are plays that I want to see. Felicia Rashad is in one on Broadway now. I was there in December and I got a chance to see 4 plays. I like it because through this medium of theater, through film and documentary, we're able to do as Marcus said, take the history and make it come alive. God bless the producers and directors and researchers and those. And a prime example is the women of the movement taking a painful story of Emmett Till and his mother and spreading it out over 6 episodes. It was 6 episodes, 2 a night, and so beautifully and visually telling this necessary but tragic and unfortunate story is the power of TV, the power of art, music. When I hear, I wish I knew what it meant to be free, I think about the power that Nina Simone had in using her vocals and the gift of piano. You know, whether it was that song or Mississippi GD, you know, or the one she did about Dr. King, the name escapes me. So music, theater, film, arts help to tell our story, which is why I'm so sad that we're not going to get to see, at least for now, this theatrical production. I went to see Rosetta and Marie just before it closed. And that night, the actress playing Rosetta had a consistent cough, and you could tell she was really fighting something. But she championed that. It was such a beautiful story, and I think for 2 nights straight, all I did was play Rosetta Tharpe songs. You know, and that's the way I get. You know, and so it's wonderful. Social media helps us. It allows us instantly, you know, to get the knowledge and to share it and pass it on. I'm going to pass. I hope we get an opportunity to share this magnificent film in some shape, form, or fashion, because I want to pass it on. I want to share it with members of my church, some of whom are watching now. I see questions in the chat as well, to educate young people about the predicament of housing. This is what they're looking at now. This is what they're listening to. So I think it's a powerful way, Kalinda, to answer. Coming to your museum, the Civil Rights Museum, to see the stories come alive, to listen to the recordings and the tape, to see the visuals and the pictures and all, I think is what we have to do to read. And I tell you, the best thing that ever happened, and I'll conclude, is Audible. Okay. I buy 5 and 6 books at a time, knowing I can't read all of these books, but I can pop Audible on and I can play it in my car while I'm walking, wherever I am. So, you know, thank God for the ability to listen to as well to these wonderful historical stories that are being told.
Thank you all for talking about impact in terms of broad reach and various forms of media. I noticed, Dr. Mason, that you said something again and again that I think is really critical as a person who does sort of history for the broader public and the public sphere, and that is about storytelling.
Yeah.
So while I don't know if you think about yourself as an artist, I would identify you as a remarkable storyteller. And I think that there is great artistry in that. And people remember stories
Yeah.
and people hold stories dear. They care about stories in a way that they don't necessarily care about facts and figures. And so certainly I think that's something that's incredibly important for all of us. I want to ask you all a follow-up question. And that question is this. We have spent, more than an hour right now discussing this issue, discussing the work that you have put into this, which extends far beyond an hour. And I'm wondering, to what end? What is your desired impact for this? What do you think would feel good and right to you for people having tuned in, or who might see your play or read your book or watch this film later, what would feel like something good was accomplished?
I'll go first. To answer Skip, you can go to segregatedbydesign.com and share it to everybody. It's free online. And I mean, that was one of the reasons why I made it, was because I didn't learn this in high school. I mean, it's not taught. And it's he actually says that in The Color of Law, Rothstein does, that he looked at all of the high school textbooks, and maybe one of them had like a line about how there was housing segregation, but it didn't like say how it happened, what was the cause, like, and so it just makes students kind of infer what happened. And so people might infer that it was just personal prejudices that caused all the segregation. And so I wanted young people to watch this and understand that something that I didn't understand when I was their age. And so when you drive through neighborhoods in the inner city or whatever, you can understand how that happened. And you don't have to, have these preconceived notions of what happened. But you can actually learn about what happened through history. And so that was the goal, is to educate, so that young people can make the change and decide on their own that what happened was wrong. And because it's going to be a slow, course to correction. But the more people that understand what happened, the greater chance that like people will actually care to, shout it from the rooftops and tell the Congress, tell president, that something has to happen, So the more people that understand what happened, the better, I think.
I think what immediately came up for me when you asked this question, which I love, I recently saw there's an apparel company, and on what they sell on their shirts and sweatshirts is "Don't sell your grandmother's house," and I love that, and I love how that company has kind of been like it's their own act of protest, because I think especially within the African American community, we all have stories of our elders passing, and then their homes don't stay within the family. And so for me, I would love to see this conversation, this amazing film, this work really spur I love like the small actions of families getting together and keeping the homes and families, the small actions of instead of buying a pair of shoes, using that money and to save for an investment property, or really looking like what does it look like to actually invest in my city, in my town, and understanding that is an act of activism, that is an act of protest. So I think that those small things is what I really do hope people think twice about, as they go about their everyday lives.
I'm so in agreement with Raven, and that shirt I need to find and get. It says a great deal. I hope that this will spark multiple conversations, and I hope that people who are watching now and who will watch later will begin to think about the history of home ownership in their families. You know, those of us who love family history research and genealogy, we're always researching people and places, but looking at the history. I have the deed to my grandparents' home that they purchased in 1958 in Jacksonville, Florida. And that is one of the more treasured documents, because they went from renting a house to buying a house in 1958 in a new community that was being built in Jacksonville, Florida. And so it goes back to telling the stories about home ownership in our family. Sunday was the 45th anniversary of the airing of Roots, Alex Haley's Roots on ABC. And I was a 14-year-old boy watching and being assigned to keep a journal by my English teacher. And by the end of the week, it was a 7-night series. My whole life was changed totally. I was so impacted by what I had seen, by the medium of film, the storytelling, all of the wonderful actors and characters that I became inquisitive and wanted to learn more about my family. And subsequently, it gave me a foray into history. So these conversations are wonderful. And the pandemic, if there's any good to come out of it, has created this medium that gives us the opportunity to gather by StreamYard, by Zoom, to bring folks together to have conversations and to talk about these things and to listen to ideas and to see film and to hear various perspectives. So a lot of good, I hope, will come from an opportunity like we've been afforded this evening.
Well, you've definitely got people thinking. We've got some good questions teed up for you from the audience, and I am going to read the first of those now. Okay. So, gentrification is a modern way the law is forcing groups out indirectly by allowing businesses to create their own policy as they see fit. This is structural oppression. How can we address an issue that is not black and white and educate others who feel that this is just normal?
Ooh, wow. That's a question. I think it is still black and white, but it's a problem. And I have experienced the blessings and curse of gentrification, buying my first home in '89, paying about $60,000 for it, living in there for about 10 years, and then selling it for about 130 and 40. I thought I had made some money. Okay. And what I found out, the people who brought the house, they fixed it up, flipped it, and sold it for more. Okay. That was my first lesson, and now some 20, 30 years later, that house is on the market now for 400,000 or 500,000. People are saying you should have kept your house. Well, I wasn't thinking about that. And so education is important. Education, of course, is key to understanding what is gentrification, and what does it mean? And no disrespect, why is it that if white people move back into the neighborhood, the property value goes up? What does that say about African Americans? Why isn't the property value going up now? I think there was a story about an appraiser who lowered the value of a house because he went in and saw photos of a black family. And so when they removed the photos and any evidence of that, the appraisal went back up a different appraisal. So this is ridiculous, but it is a reality. It really is a reality. And I think it's going to take a policy, Mayor Dickens now and the city council from a local level, from our state level, and from our federal level are going to have to enact policies that protect people, common people, hardworking people who just want to live decently and affordably, in a house and in a good neighborhood.
Yeah. Raven, it looked like you were going to say something.
No, I was going to say, Dr. Mason, I think you answered that perfectly. That was perfect. Yeah.
I asked Rothstein that question when I was recording that voiceover. And one thing that he mentioned was to not be afraid to go to the school board and make sure that the history is being taught, and for your kids' sake and for their friends and their parents to that this will be taught, because without us standing up for what our kids are learning, no one's going to stand up for them if we're not going to. So that was one thing that I have young kids, and so that kind of stood out for me, wanting this to be taught, and not just because I'm going to be teaching it to my kids, but like their friends that their parents might not be teaching that to them, you know. So and not understand what my kids do. So that, I think, needs to be something that we shouldn't be afraid to like go to people that have the power to kind of change what's being taught.
I think that's a particularly cogent point right now when there's so much effort to narrow
Yeah,
talk
yeah.
with regards to the kind of the truth of history, um, even as we sit here.
And so does that
Um,
mean, Kalinda, that field trips to the Civil Rights Museum and the Atlanta History Center, and the Apex Museum are all canceled now because you're forcing kids to go and learn and see about history and culture? I mean, it's something to think about. I don't know that that's the case, but it's implied based on the actions.
It actually really is implied. It's a big question. And I will say, sitting in the position that I do at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights is something that we talk about explicitly often because, on the one hand, there are things that are in the curriculum that teachers come to us to get kind of support for and amplification for, right? And that's part of the field trip, right? The field trips and our work with teachers in schools directly. Um, but then there's also, quite a lot that even before the most recent round of culture wars was already being left out. It is already the case, right? I could probably say, like, who do you hear about in Black History Month? We're gonna name three people, two people, right? I we used to joke when I was at the Atlanta History Center that the students would go see the slave cabins so they could understand where Martin Luther King freed the slaves. I mean, this enormous gap, right, in real deep understanding and context. And so to some extent our cultural institutions are stopgaps. We stand in the gap between what can be imparted through the curriculum and, for whatever reasons, what may be left out of both the curricula and the textbooks, because the textbooks follow the state mandates around curriculum. So yeah, that's a really incredibly important question. And I think it also ties together this question about caring and empathy and feeling, right? So much is not just about what we know, but what we care about and are willing to lend ourselves to and risk something for. Um, I have another question from an audience member. And this question is, my age is telling. My glasses on. What is the panelist's answer to the housing crisis that is going on not only in Atlanta, but in the nation? Increasing housing prices, taxes, and insurance is making it difficult to envision African Americans staying within our homes. And I would add to that question, or purchasing homes.
Well, it is certainly a crisis. It has certainly reached crisis level. Um, and I just think that this is where policies are going to have to be made to support and help those persons who are experiencing uh, these increases in taxes. Going in and building. Well, in Atlanta, Vine City, they've gone in and they put these filler homes in. Okay, in between these historic homes, filler homes, and that are pricing $400,000 and $500,000. So where are the regulations to prevent that from happening, particularly if it's not designated as a historic district? So it's a lot. It's a lot going on, and it's going to take a lot of intervention from our government and elected officials, people that we elect to office, that we're going to have to continue to ask them to help people. I think Mayor Keisha Lance Bottom worked to enact affordable housing, and I think Mayor Dickens is picking that up. But there are a lot of people who are impacted and affected by it. Let me say this quickly. I became a member of the Atlanta Beltline Partnership Board reluctantly. because on my Facebook page, I have a little Facebook page called Vanishing Black Atlanta, where I give folks an opportunity to vent, to chime in. And the comments about the Beltline were not very encouraging, their perception. And so I accepted an invitation to join the Atlanta Beltline Partnership so that I could learn more and perhaps be an advocate, particularly for those in the community, and to understand what is it and how are the people in the Vine City community, Atlanta University Center, the Just Us community. Someone asked about the Just Us community, that small enclave of about 50, 60 homes built in the 1940s, had difficulty getting financing and mortgages. Thank God for Citizens Trust Bank and Standard Bank. They were built by Black contractors, the Watley brothers and Chief Aiken. But Black folks wanted an affordable place to live. And so the same concerns that they have, we still have now, but we need some intervention, and it's going to have to come from the government level, in my opinion.
There is another question that's somewhat related to the solutions that you're positing. So I wanted to come to this one. The question says, our team has always been curious about the creation of community trusts that subsidize and offset property taxes for communities experiencing gentrification. As businesses and new developments emerge, how do we give legacy homeowners greater options? This is a very specific question, and I'm not sure whether the panelists know specific answers to this or not. If you do, please share. But beyond that, I think part of what's coming up is this notion of collective community building and collective support around home ownership and around enabling people to stay within communities, even if they're not homeowners, right? One of the issues with gentrification is that so many people who are renters are being displaced permanently from communities because the safeguards that are being put in place really only apply to homeowners. So I'm just wondering if you all might say whatever comes to mind for you around grassroots efforts to maintain community, things that feel contemporarily or historically significant in terms of ways people have built and safeguarded community.
Well, in Austin, there's I live in a community where it's a mixed income community where the percentage of the homes are set aside for people with a like certain amount of the median income of Austin. So people can afford to live in this neighborhood that might be priced out otherwise. They might not be able to sell it for as much or gain as much from selling it as someone that owns it outright, like that buys it at the normal price. But they do gain a certain percentage every year, like a 2 or 3% increase, even though they bought it at a low rate. So that sort of thing is something that the government can do locally, can create neighborhoods where a certain percentage of homes are affordable.
Raven, were you about?
Yeah. I think that's so fascinating. I think that I look at my own circumstances in life, and I am a homeowner, but I live in the Brookhaven area of Atlanta, above Buckhead, and I am, I'm one of very few families that live in my neighborhood, and then those friends or colleagues that I do know who are either interested in home ownership or just recently bought. I think that one of the things that's kind of common is just like when it comes to community engagement, just a lack of education, period, and a lack of information, and so many people of color, friends who are interested in taking part in home ownership just don't have the information that we need first to just be in the community, let alone, to grow those communities that we are interested in taking ownership in. So I think for me, it's just really just highlighting or looking into educating on how we can really, on educating especially young Black people, and so how we can really start to take ownership of our communities and why that is so important.
There are a lot of predators. There are companies, people preying on homeowners on a daily basis. I hear often that people are calling almost daily, are sending flyers, are actually bold enough to come trying to get them to sell their home, their mother's home, their grandparents' home, etc. So we need strong advocacy. We also need to hold our NPUs, our neighborhood planning uh, units, accountable. We need to hold our local elected officials accountable. And as homeowners in our communities, we need to be engaged. We need to be present. Some people, however, do not have the ability to voice and express. Who's protecting some of the elderly homeowners? Okay, I read a comment where I think someone said that her ex-husband and brother sold the home before it could be quit claim. Because, and I don't know the reasons, but we know the possibilities. Someone makes an offer, probably undervalued, but it's a financial offer. So we just need advocacy to and advocates rather to continue to address and speak out for those for people and neighborhoods that have a lot of issues and challenges, and we have a lot of it in Atlanta. Lots of it. And my church that I pastor, West Mitchell Street, is in the Vine City AU community. It's right across from Morris Brown. And the piece that's missing is neighborhood and community, which in some of these areas, we don't see that anymore. People have moved to the suburbs, okay? And they moved out. So in the inner cities, you don't have that sense of community like you used to have, which is what Lena Younger wanted, okay? She wanted a house where she could plant and grow her flowers, a sense of community. That's all that she wanted. Now you're going to make me go and watch A Raisin in the Sun tonight before I turn in. But that's all she wanted. And I think that's what anybody wants, just the ability to own your own home, to call it your home, and to be a part of a community. I think that's what we all want at some point in time.
You're muted. Sorry.
Thank you. I thought I would get through one day without this, and of course, live stream. Here we go. I was saying that I think that was so well stated by all of you, and I think that sometimes people don't realize how much knowledge and power they have. People sometimes think that they don't know enough to be able to speak to these issues or to serve as an advocate. And I just want to remind people that there are so many things that are really important to do and accessible to one in terms of this work. For example, I live in town in the Grant Park, Ormo Park area, so gentrification ground zero. And one of the big concerns that we had was as simple as the fact that neighborhood meetings were happening in the middle of the day. So people who might be working hourly jobs could not attend those meetings, could not voice their concerns, could not share their perspectives. So when the community's perspective about whatever the case might be, whether it's, tax abatements or whatever the concerns were, they were really only reflecting the newer residents who were professionals, who had jobs, that they could, get away from at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And so just even advocating around something like that, whether you know the codes, whether you know the legalities, whether are incredibly important things that folks can do. And advocating for the rights of renters to remain in desirable neighborhoods is an incredibly important issue. We certainly are seeing a lot of that right now as we talk about density changes in zoning, which often is related to bringing greater numbers of renters in, and a societal perception that renters are necessarily undesirable neighbors, which is problematic and disproportionately impacts low-income people and people of color, and Black people very specifically. You all have given us so much to think about and so much to do. And I just want, on behalf of everybody watching, to thank all of the panelists for your participation this evening, for the great work that you do. Raven, I can't wait to come and see your play and encourage everybody here to do the same. And I'd like to transition us now to another performance. This time we are going to be hearing I Know I've Been Changed, which is a spiritual, again performed by Maisha McQueen and accompanied by S. Renee Clark.
I know I've been changed. I know I've been changed. Ooh, Lord, know I've been changed. The angels in heaven done sign my name. Oh, I know I've been changed. I know I've been changed. Good Lord, know I've been changed. The angels in heaven done sign my name. Hey, if you don't believe I've been redeemed, oh, the angels in heaven done sign my name. Well, follow me down that Jordan stream. You know the angels in heaven done sign my name. Well, I stepped in the water. The water was cold. The angels in heaven done sign my name. Oh, it's chill my body, but not my soul. I know the angels in heaven done sign my name. Good Lord, I know I've been changed. Oh, I know I've been changed. Good Lord, I know I've been changed. The angels in heaven done sign my name. Hey, the angels in heaven done sign my name. You know the angels in heaven done sign my name.
Hello, I'm Michael Crute.
And I'm Justin Anderson.
We're real estate agents with the Welcome Home Atlanta team, powered by Keller Williams, and we're honored to partner with True Colors Theater in today's conversation.
There are obvious disparities between the wealth and homeownership gaps in this country. And though there are many holes to be filled, the one gap we know that we can help bridge with confidence is the education gap.
Here and now, let's break the bond of shame around
Yes.
money and real estate and realize that it's completely normal and okay to not know how to go about any of this. For years, policies, people, and programs prohibited people of color, especially Black people, from obtaining the dream of home ownership. So, if it wasn't taught to you or modeled for you, how in the world are you supposed to know how to do this?
Right?
It's okay not to know. You can learn, and we'd love to guide you.
At Welcome Home Atlanta, we believe that home is more than a roof over our heads. It's a treasure chest that houses our most priceless memories and experiences. And it also serves as one of the greatest financial assets you could possess. Owning a home can be a wealth-building engine for you, your family, and your future. But many of us aren't taught to see the wealth that we have, or are given the tools to know how to extract it, how to use it, and how to make it work for us to build our dreams and our legacy.
Knowledge is power, but only if it is both understood and applied.
Right.
And that's why as a team, we're committed to demystifying the process, dismantling the policies that try to prohibit access, and uncovering programs and leveraging tools to help our clients exceed their goals faster and in less time.
Good, solid, reputable information from a real estate agent should never cost you a dime.
Not one penny.
Which is why it's important to find someone who has your best interest at heart, who understands your goals and can help you create a roadmap to achieve them now and in the future.
Yes, that goes for buyers and sellers. Listen, if you own a home, hang up on those people who call you and say, they're buying homes just like yours in the area. And please tear up those postcards that dangle the carrot of a quick sale for cash today.
Why? Because these companies and investors seek to exploit people who don't have the knowledge or the counsel to realize that they could be giving up more than 30% of their home's actual value by selling it to them.
With so much noise, misinformation, and underrepresentation, you may be asking yourself, what do I do when I don't know what to do? And it's easy. Give us a call, send us an email, and let's work together to create a roadmap specifically for you.
If you're going to sell, take your wealth with you.
Yes.
If you're looking to buy, seek out sound counsel.
Your story is the most important possession you have, and your home is an integral part of that story. In spite of the past and because of what's at stake in the future, we invite you to take your narrative back today.
Your next best chapter is waiting to be written, and we're here to help.
Welcome home.
Good evening, everyone. How you doing? My name is Jamil Jude, and I have the best job in the American theater because I'm the artistic director here at True Colors Theater Company. And I just want to thank you all for tuning in and listening to our community conversation tonight, Segregated by Design. I have the job of saying thank you to so many wonderful people that helped make this possible. First, I want to give a big shout out and a thank you to our friends at Hands in Motion for helping us describe through ASL this amazing conversation, as well as our community partners here at WABE and the Center for Civil and Human Rights. You all saw an amazing panel conversation moderated by Dr. Kalinda Lee, and thank you to all of our panelists. This would not have been able, and we would not have been able to do this today without the support of Bank of America and our good friends at Brian Cave, Leighton Pace, and I always say it always pays to have a good lawyer team on your side, and our friends at BCLP help make this possible. You know, with True Colors and our hiatus from stage, it's been so challenging for us to want to be on stage and want to give you continued live performance, but it's things like this that allow us to thrive at the intersection of artistic excellence and civic engagement. So thank you all so very much for tuning in to this community conversation. Stay tuned to us at True Colors, because our return to the live stage will be soon. Be so soon, and we can't wait to enjoy and bring you all back to the Southwest Arts Center when it is time. You know, continue to look out for us on our website, truecolorstheater.org. Sign up for our mailing list and stay connected to us as we continue to try to bring you top level theater here in the Atlanta area. Yeah, I wouldn't be doing my job as artistic director if I didn't tell you that this work and this free community conversation is because of the amazing support that we receive from individuals and foundations. So thank you for your generosity. Please help us kick off the new year with your continued support. You have done an amazing job in paying attention today. We hope that the things that Dr. Kalinda Lee and this amazing panel said motivates you to get more involved in your local civic communities, so that we can find ways that when change happens, that the people that lose out don't look like us. So again, on behalf of everyone on staff at True Colors Theater, thank you for attending our community conversation today. I hope you have a really wonderful evening.